Chapter 7. There was straw scattered on the floor over a layer of rushes. There was an open log fire, sputtering and blazing in a large fireplace. There were a few chickens, strutting and pecking on the floor. There were seats with hand-embroidered cushions on them, and there were tapestries covering the windows and the doors. Richard stumbled forward as the train lurched out of the station. He reached out, grabbed hold of the nearest person, and regained his balance. The nearest person happened to be a short, grey, elderly man-at-arms, who would have looked, Richard decided, exactly like a recently retired government employee, were it not for the tin hat, the surcoat, the rather clumsily knitted chainmail, and the spear. Instead, he looked like a recently retired government employee who had, somewhat against his will, been dragooned into his local amateur dramatic society where he had been forced to play a man-at-arms. The little grey man blinked short-sightedly at Richard as Richard grabbed him, and then he said, lugubriously, "Sorry about that." "My fault," said Richard. "I know," said the man. An enormous Irish wolfhound padded down the aisle and stopped beside a lute player who sat on the floor, picking at a gladsome melody in a desultory fashion. The wolfhound glared at Richard, snorted with disdain, then lay down and went to sleep. At the far end of the carriage, an elderly falconer, with a hooded falcon on his wrist, was exchanging pleasantries with a small knot of damoiselles of a certain age. Some passengers obviously stared at the four travellers, others just as obviously ignored them. It was, Richard realised, as if someone had taken a small medieval court and put it, as best they could, in one carriage of an underground train. A herald raised his bugle to his lips and played a tuneless blast as an immense elderly man in a huge fur-lined dressing gown and carpet slippers staggered through the connecting door to the next compartment, his arm resting on the shoulder of a jester in shabby motley. The old man was larger than life in every way. He wore an eye patch over his left eye, which had the effect of making him look slightly helpless and unbalanced, like a one-eyed hawk. There were fragments of food in his red-grey beard, and what appeared to be pyjama pants were visible at the bottom of his shabby fur gown. That, thought Richard, correctly, must be the Earl. The Earl's jester, an elderly man with a pinched, humourless mouth and a painted face, looked like he had fled from a life as an all-round entertainer near the bottom of the bill on the Victorian music halls 100 years before. He led the Earl to a throne-like carved wooden seat, in which, a trifle unsteadily, the Earl sat down. The wolfhound got up, padded down the length of the carriage, and settled itself at the Earl's slippered feet. Earl's Court, thought Richard. Of course. And then he began to wonder whether there was a Baron in Baron's Court tube station, or a Raven in Raven's Court, or... The little old man-at-arms coughed, asthmatically, and said, "Right then, you lot, state your business." Dor stepped forward. She held her head up high, suddenly seeming taller and more at ease than Richard had previously seen her, and she said, "We seek an audience with His Grace, the Earl." The Earl called down the carriage. "What did the little girl say, Halvard?" he asked. Richard wondered if he were deaf. Halvard, the elderly man-at-arms, shuffled around and cupped his hand to his mouth. "They seek an audience, your grace," he shouted, over the rattle of the train. The Earl pushed aside his thick fur cap and scratched his head meditatively. He was balding underneath his cap. "They do? An audience? How splendid! Who are they, Halvard?" Halvard turned back to them. "He wants to know who you all are. Keep it short, though. Don't go on." "I am the Lady Dor," announced Dor. "The Lord Portico was my father." The Earl brightened at this, leaned forward, peered through the smoke with his one good eye. "Did she say she was Portico's oldest girl?" he asked the jester. "Yes, your grace." The Earl beckoned to Dor. "Come here," he said. Come. Let me look at you." She walked down the swaying carriage, grabbing the thick rope straps that hung from the ceiling as she went to keep her balance. When she stood before the Earl's wooden chair, she curtsied. He scratched at his beard and stared at her. We were all quite devastated to hear of your father's unfortunate," said the Earl, and then he interrupted himself and said, "Well, all your family, it was a—" And he trailed off and said, I had the warmest regards for him, did a bit of business together. Good old Portico, full of ideas." He stopped. Then he tapped the jester on the shoulder and whispered, in a querulous boom, loud enough that it could be heard easily over the noise of the train, "Go and make jokes at them, Thule. Earn your keep." The Earl's fool staggered up the aisle with an arthritic mop and a rheumatic mow. He stopped in front of Richard. "And who might you be?" he asked. Me," said Richard. "Me? My name is Richard. Richard Mayhew." "Me?" squeaked the fool, in an elderly, rather theatrical imitation of Richard's Scottish accent. "Me? Me? La nuncle, 'tis not a man, but a mooncalf." The courtiers sniggered dustily. "And I," de Carabas told the jester, with a blinding smile, "call myself the Marquis de Carabas." The fool blinked. "De Carabas the thief?" asked the jester. "De Carabas the body-snatcher? De Carabas the traitor?" He turned to the courtiers around them. "But this cannot be de Carabas. For why? Because de Carabas has long since been banished from the Earl's presence. Perhaps it is instead a strange new species of stoat who grew particularly large." The courtiers tittered uneasily, and a low buzz of troubled conversation began. The Earl said nothing, but his lips were pressed together tightly, and he had begun to tremble. "I am called Hunter," said Hunter to the jester. The courtiers were silent then. The jester opened his mouth as if he were going to say something, and then he looked at her and he closed his mouth again. A hint of a smile played at the corner of Hunter's perfect lips. "Go on," she said. "Say something funny." The jester stared at the trailing toes of his shoes, then he muttered, "My hound hath no nose." The Earl, who had been staring at the Marquis de Carabas like a slow-burning fuse, pop-eyed, white-lipped, unable to believe the evidence of his senses, now exploded to his feet, a grey-bearded volcano, an elderly berserker. His head brushed the roof of the carriage. He pointed at the Marquis and shouted, spittle flying, "I will not stand for it! I will not! Make him come forward!" Halvard waggled a gloomy spear at the Marquis, who sauntered to the front of the train until he stood, beside Dor, in front of the Earl's throne. The wolfhound growled in the back of its throat. "You," said the Earl, stabbing the air with a huge knotted finger. "I know you, de Carabas. I haven't forgotten. I may be old, but I haven't forgotten." The Marquis bowed. "Might I remind your Grace," he said urbanely, "that we had a deal. I negotiated the peace treaty between your people and the Ravenscourt, and in return you agreed to provide a little favour." "So there is a Ravenscourt," thought Richard. He wondered what it was like. "A little "Favour," said the Earl. He turned a deep beetroot colour. "Is that what you call it? I lost 12 men to your foolishness in the retreat from White City. I lost an eye." "And if you don't mind my saying so, your Grace," said the Marquis graciously, "that is a very fetching patch. It sets off your face perfectly." "I swore," fulminated the Earl, beard bristling. I swore that if you ever set foot in my domain, I would—" He trailed off, shook his head, confused and forgetful. Then he continued, "It'll come back to me. I do not forget." "He might not be entirely pleased to see you," whispered Dor to de Carabas. "Well, he's not," he muttered back. Dor stepped forward once more. "Your Grace," she said, loudly, clearly, "de Carabas is here with me as my guest and my companion. For the fellowship there has ever been between your family and mine, for the friendship between my father and—" "He abused my hospitality," boomed the Earl. "I swore that, if he ever again entered my domain, I would have him gutted and dried, like something that's been, gutted first, and then, dried. Perchance a kipper, my lord?" suggested the jester. The Earl shrugged. "It is of no matter. Guards, seize him." And they did. While neither of the guards would ever see 60 again, each of them was holding a crossbow, pointed at the Marquis, and their hands did not tremble, neither with age nor fear. Richard looked at Hunter. She seemed untroubled by this, watching it almost with amusement, like someone watching a piece of drama played out for their benefit. Dor folded her arms and stood taller, putting her head back, raising her pointed chin. She looked less like a ragged street pixie, more like someone used to getting her own way. The opal eyes flashed. "Your Grace, the Marquis is with me as my companion on my quest. Our families have been friends for a long time now." "Yes, they have," interrupted the Earl helpfully. "Hundreds of years. Hundreds and hundreds. Knew your grandfather, too. Funny old fellow. Bit vague," he confided. "But I am forced to say that I will take an act of violence against my companion as an act of aggression against myself and my house." The girl stared up at the old man. He towered over her. They stood for some moments, frozen. He tugged on his red and grey beard agitatedly, then he thrust out his lower lip like a small child. "I will not have him here," he said. The Marquis took out the golden pocket watch he had found in Portico's study. He examined it carelessly. Then he turned to Dor and said, as if none of the events around them had occurred, "My lady, I will obviously be of more use to you off this train than on, and I have other avenues to explore." "No," she said. "If you go, we all go." "I don't think so," said the Marquis. "Hunter will look after you as long as you stay in London below. I'll meet you at the next market. Don't do anything too stupid in the meantime." The train was coming into a station. Dor fixed the Earl with her look. There was something more ancient and powerful in those huge opal-coloured eyes, in their pale heart-shaped face, than her young years would have seemed to allow. Richard noticed that the room fell quiet whenever she spoke. "Will you let him go in peace, Your Grace?" she asked. The Earl ran his hands over his face, rubbed his good eye and his eye patch, then looked back at her. "Just make him go," said the Earl. He looked at the Marquis. "Next time," he ran a thick old finger across his Adam's apple, "kipper." The Marquis bowed low. "I'll see myself out," he said to the guards, and stepped toward the open door. Halvard raised his crossbow, pointed it toward the Marquis's back. Hunter reached out her hand and pushed the end of the crossbow back down toward the floor. The Marquis stepped onto the platform, turned and waved an ironic goodbye flourish at them. The door hissed closed behind him. The Earl sat down on his huge chair at the end of the carriage. He said nothing. The train rattled and lurched through the dark tunnel. "Where are my manners?" muttered the Earl to himself. He looked at them with one staring eye. Then he said it again in a desperate boom that Richard could feel in his stomach like a bass drum beat. "Where are my manners?" He motioned one of the elderly men-at-arms to him. They will be hungry after their journey, Dagvard, thirsty too, I shouldn't wonder." "Yes, your grace." "Stop the train!" called the Earl. The doors hissed open, and Dagvard scuttled off onto a platform. Richard watched the people on the platform. No one came into their carriage. No one seemed to notice that anything was at all odd, or in any way unusual. Dagvard walked over to a vending machine on the side of the platform. He took off his helmet. Then he rapped, with one mailed glove, on the side of the machine. "Orders from the Earl," he said. "Chocolates." A ratcheting whir came from deep in the guts of the machine, and it began to spit out dozens of Cadbury's fruit and nut chocolate bars, one after another. Dagvard held his metal helmet below the opening to catch them. The doors began to close. Halvard put the handle of his pike between the doors, and they opened again and began bumping open and shut on the pike handle. "Please stand clear of the doors," said a loudspeaker voice. "The train cannot leave until the doors are all closed." The Earl was staring at door lopsidedly, with his one good eye. "So, what brings you here to me?" he asked. She licked her lips. "Well, indirectly, your grace. My father's death." He nodded, slowly. "Yes, you seek vengeance. Quite right, too." He coughed, then recited in a basso profundo, "Brave the battling blade, flashes the furious fire, steel sword sheathed in hated heart, crimsons the something. Yes." "Vengeance?" Dor thought for a moment. "Yes, that was what my father said. But I just want to understand what happened and to protect myself. My family had no enemies." Dagvard staggered back onto the train then, his helmet filled with chocolate bars and cans of Coke. The doors were permitted to close, and the train moved off once more. Lear's coat, still on the floor of the tunnel, was covered in coins and banknotes now. But it was also covered with shoes. Shoes worn on feet, shoes which were kicking the coins, smearing and tearing the banknotes, ripping the fabric of the coat. There was money underfoot, and no one seemed to notice. Lear had begun to cry. "Please, why won't you leave me alone?" he begged. He was backed against the wall of the passage. Blood ran down his face and dripped crimson into his beard. His saxophone hung limply, awkwardly, on his chest, dented and scraped. He was surrounded by a small crowd of people, more than 20, less than 50. Every one of them shoving and pushing in a mindless mob, with their eyes blank and staring, each man and woman fighting and clawing in order desperately to try and give Lear their money. There was blood on the tiled wall where Lear had knocked his head. Lear flailed out at one middle-aged woman, her purse wide open, a fistful of £5 notes thrust out at him. She clawed at his face in her eagerness to give him her money. He twisted to avoid her fingernails and fell to the tunnel floor. Someone trod on his hand. His face was pushed into a slurry of coins. He began to sob and to curse. "I told you not to overuse it," said an elegant voice nearby. "Naughty." "Help me," gasped Lear. "Well, there is a counter-charm," admitted the voice, almost reluctantly. The crowd was pressing closer now. A flung 50-pence coin opened Lear's cheek. He curled into a fetal ball, hugging himself, burying his face in his knees. "Play it, damn you," sobbed Lear. "Whatever you want, just make them stop." A penny whistle piping began softly and echoed down the passage. A simple phrase, repeated over and over, slightly different every time, the Decaribus variations. The footsteps were moving away, shuffling at first, then picking up pace, moving away from him. He opened his eyes. The Marquis de Caribus was leaning against the wall, playing the penny whistle. When he saw Lear looking at him, he took the whistle from his lips, replaced it in an inside pocket of his coat. He tossed Lear a lace-edged handkerchief of patched linen. Lear wiped the blood from his forehead and face. "They would have killed me," he said, accusingly. "I did warn you," said de Caribus. "Just count yourself lucky I was coming back this way." He helped Lear into a sitting position. "Now," he said, "I think you owe me another favour." Lear picked up his coat, torn and muddy, and imprinted with the marks of many feet, from the passage floor. He suddenly felt very cold, and he wrapped the shredded coat around his shoulders. Coins fell and notes fluttered to the floor. He let them lie. "Was I really lucky? Or did you set me up?" The Marquis looked almost offended. "I don't know how you could even bring yourself to think such a thing. 'Cause I know you, that's how. So what is it this time? Theft? Arson?" Lear sounded resigned and a little sad. And then, murder? De Caribus reached down and took back his handkerchief. "Theft, I'm afraid. You were right the first time," he said with a smile. "I find myself in rather urgent need of a piece of Tang Dynasty sculpture." Lear shivered. Then, slowly, he nodded. Richard was handed a bar of vending machine-sized Cadbury's Fruit and Nut chocolate and a large silver goblet ornamented around the rim with what appeared to Richard to be sapphires. The goblet was filled with Coca-Cola. The jester, whose name appeared to be Thule, cleared his throat loudly. "Ahem! I would like to propose a toast to our guests," he said. "A child, a bravo, a fool. May they each get what they deserve." "Which one am I?" whispered Richard to Hunter. "The fool, of course," she said. "In the old days," said Halvard dismally after sipping his coke, "we had wine. I prefer wine. It's not as sticky." "Do all the machines just give you things like that?" asked Richard. "Oh, yes," said the old man. "They listen to the Earl, you see. He rules the underground, the bit with the trains. He's lord of the Central, the Circle, the Jubilee, the Victorious, the Bakerloo, well, all of them except the underside line." "What's the underside line?" asked Richard. Halvard shook his head and pursed his lips. Hunter brushed Richard's shoulder with her fingers. "Remember what I told you about the shepherds of Shepherd's Bush? You said I didn't want to meet them, and there were some things I was probably better off not knowing." "Good," she said. "So now you can add the underside line to the list of things you're better off not knowing." Dor came back down the carriage toward them. She was smiling. "The Earl's agreed to help us," she said. "Come on. He's meeting us in the library." Richard was almost proud of the way he didn't say, "What library?" or point out that you couldn't put a library on a train. Instead, he followed Dor toward the Earl's empty throne, and round the back of it, and through the connecting door behind it, and into the library. It was a huge stone room, with a high wooden ceiling. Each wall was covered with shelves. Each shelf was laden with objects. There were books, yes, but the shelves were filled with a host of other things: tennis rackets, hockey sticks, umbrellas, a spade, a notebook computer, a wooden leg, several mugs, dozens of shoes, pairs of binoculars, a small log, 6 glove puppets, a lava lamp, various CDs, records, LPs, 45s and 78s, cassette tapes and 8-tracks, dice, toy cars, assorted pairs of dentures, watches, flashlights, 4 garden gnomes of assorted sizes, 2 fishing, one of them mooning, the last smoking a cigar, piles of newspapers, magazines, grimoires, 3-legged stools, a box of cigars, a plastic nodding-head Alsatian, socks. The room was a tiny empire of lost property. "This is his real domain," muttered Hunter. "Things lost, things forgotten." There were windows set in the stone wall. Through them, Richard could see the rattling darkness and the passing lights of the underground tunnels. The Earl was sitting on the floor, with his legs splayed, patting the wolfhound and scratching it underneath the chin. The jester stood beside him, looking embarrassed. The Earl clambered to his feet when he saw them, his forehead creased. "Ah, there you are. Now there was a reason I asked you here. It'll come to me." He tugged at his red-grey beard, a tiny gesture from such a huge man. "The Angel Islington, Your Grace," said Dor politely. "Oh, yes. Your father had a lot of ideas, you know. Ask me about them. I don't trust change. I sent him to Islington." He stopped, blinked his one eye. "Did I tell you this already?" "Yes, Your Grace. And how can we get to Islington?" He nodded as if she had said something profound. "Only once by the quick way. After that you have to go the long way down. Dangerous," Dor said patiently. "And the quick way is?" "Oh, no. I need to be an opener to use it. Only good for Portico's family." He rested a huge hand on her shoulder. Then his hand slid up to her cheek. "Better off staying here with me. Keep an old man warm at night, eh?" He leered at her and touched her tangle of hair with his old fingers. Hunter took a step toward Dor. Dor gestured with her hand. "No, not yet." Dor looked up at the Earl and said, "Your Grace, I am Portico's oldest daughter. How do I get to the Angel Islington?" Richard found himself amazed that Dor was able to keep her temper in the face of the Earl's obviously losing battle with temporal drift. The Earl winked his single eye in a solemn blink, an old hawk, his head tipped on one side. Then he took his hand from her hair. So you are, Portico's daughter. How is your dear father? Keeping well, I hope? Fine man, good man." "How do we get to the Angel Islington?" said Dor, but there was a tremble in her voice. "Oh, I use the Angelus, of course." Richard found himself imagining the Earl, 60, 80, 500 years ago. A mighty warrior, a cunning strategist, a great lover of women, a fine friend, a terrifying foe. There was still the wreckage of that man in there somewhere. That was what made him so terrible and so sad. The Earl fumbled on the shelves, moving pens and pipes and pea-shooters, little gargoyles and dead leaves. Then, like an aged cat stumbling on a mouse, he seized a small, rolled-up scroll and handed it to the girl. "Here you go, lassie," said the Earl. "All in here, and I suppose we'd better drop you off where you need to go." "You'll drop us off?" asked Richard. "In a train?" The Earl looked around for the source of the sound, focused on Richard, and smiled enormously. "Oh, think nothing of it," he boomed. "Anything for Portico's daughter." Dor clutched the scroll tightly, triumphantly. Richard could feel the train beginning to slow, and he and Dor and Hunter were led out of the stone room and back into the carriage. Richard peered out at the platform as they slowed down. "Excuse me, what station is this?" he asked. The train had stopped, facing one of the station signs. "British Museum," it said. Somehow, this was an oddity too many. He could accept the Mind the Gap thing, and the Earl's Court, and even the strange library. But, damn it, like all Londoners, he knew his tube map, and this was going too far. "There isn't a British Museum station," said Richard, firmly. "There isn't?" boomed the Earl. Then you must be very careful as you get off the train." And he guffawed delightedly and tapped his jester on the shoulder. "Hear that, truly? I am as funny as you are." The jester smiled as bleak a smile as ever was seen. "My sides are splitting, my ribs are cracking, and my mirth is positively uncontainable, your grace," he said. The doors hissed open. Dor smiled up at the Earl. "Thank you," she said. "Off, off," said the vast old man, shooing Dor and Richard and Hunter out of the warm, smoky carriage onto the empty platform. And then the doors closed, and the train moved away, and Richard found himself staring at a sign which, no matter how many times he blinked, nor even if he looked away from it and looked back suddenly to take it by surprise, still obstinately persisted in saying, "British Museum."